Oh, the shame of the private sector. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, it seems like in the Democratic Party, and specifically in the race for the presidency right now, the private sector is coming under increasing opprobrium from candidates and people who are supporters of these various candidates. The latest
All
to
candidates?
experience this, the latest to experience this is Mayor Pete Buttigieg from South Bend, Indiana, who was essentially being pressured to reveal his client list when he served a couple of years after college graduation. He worked with the private sector company McKinsey, a consulting firm probably best known for the fact that Tom Peters, co-author of In Search of Excellence many years ago, biggest selling business book of all time at the time, that Peters was a McKinsey consultant. And so Buttigieg has been forced basically to talk about this and to talk about some of the clients he served despite a non-disclosure agreement that he had with his former employer. And I found it interesting, Bill, that Buttigieg in his comments says that McKinsey was amoral, like most American businesses, and client-focused, like most American corporations. And
he's done.
And he did acknowledge that private sector experience helps him in running an organization. He knows how to read a spreadsheet, for example, and so that's helpful in being able to run, a city or a country. But here's the quote from Pete Buttigieg that I wanted to get your reaction to. I also walked away from the private sector early in my career to take on public service and never looked back. What does that sound like to you, Bill?
Sounds like a guy who's gunning for the top job in the country, who, if he hadn't left the public sector, probably could have found himself, without question, I think, a regional manager of a significant size corporation based on his obvious managerial skills, not being facetious about that. Joe Biden couldn't run Walmart. He couldn't run a Walmart. But Pete Buttigieg certainly has the skill level and the ability, charisma, intelligence to have made it as a significant vice president, maybe, or regional vice president of some major corporation. He decided to, out of the goodness of his heart, leave that sterling future behind and get into politics, where he's now determined to become the most powerful man in the world. So you can hardly imagine just the awe I feel to be a member of the same country of a person that has that kind of nobility deep down in his bones.
It sounds like he's more than a little bit ashamed. And frankly, the piece that I read in the Atlantic.com unfavorably compares him with Barack Obama, who spent his relative youth out there.
Never worked a day in his life like Bernie Sanders.
That's $1,000 a year.
Credentials.
Well, here's the contrast, Bill. They're saying Barack Obama sacrificed personal income in order to serve his community. But Pete Buttigieg apparently went after the money. And Buttigieg acknowledges that indeed he did want the money. And then the other criticism is he worked for these fat cat corporations, one of which turns out to be one of the Blue Cross Blue Shield companies. And he had to come out publicly and say that as far as he knows, he never did anything to affect anybody's access to health insurance.
No, thank God. I was employed in the private sector for many years, but you'll be relieved to know that I didn't do anything. As disturbing as all of this is, in the sense that one of two national parties now goes on a witch hunt, not because somebody was a member of the Communist Party and planted bombs or something, that'd get them the nomination. Now they go on a witch hunt for somebody who did productive work for a brief period of time before gaining their way into their rightful place as a parasite. And so that alone would be disturbing. But what is not disturbing, and what is in fact highly encouraging, is that Pete Buttigieg is the only. When I say he's the only candidate that I fear, I don't fear him. I don't think he's got a chance against Donald Trump. But of all the people in the field who I would worry would have a chance against Donald Trump, he's number one on the list by far. And the reason I say that is because he's got a relatively clean record. He was relatively sane. He served in the military. That's a bonus for me. And of course, he's gay, which if he wasn't gay, he wouldn't be one of the 3 or 4 remaining Democratic candidates, because identity politics is how the left functions, and whether or not he's qualified to be up there, I believe that any citizen essentially is certainly qualified to run. So I don't have any problem with him being up there at all. But he wouldn't be a leading candidate for the Democratic Party top 5 anyway, if he wasn't gay. But he is, so he is. So what I find particularly enlightening and encouraging about this fact that he's now defending the fact that he actually had a job for a little while is that it is yet another indication to me that the most dangerous candidate that the Democrats could field has no chance of being elected by his own party. He has no chance of being elected by his own party. That some people must look at him as Bloomberg light. By the way, Bloomberg light is like trying to think of hydrogen light. It's like what gets lighter than Bloomberg? But apparently, he made money in the private sector. Really? Did he now? Did he keep the money? He did. He paid taxes, but he kept the rest of it.
Well, it seems to me, Bill, that even if you're a Democrat, I think that the balance of employment still favors the private sector, although I haven't seen the latest numbers. Who knows? Maybe there are more people employed in the public sector than in the private sector, but I don't think that's the case. And
no, my point, though, let me just finish. I'm sorry.
Going after candidates because they worked in the private sector or they are affiliated with the private sector or they take money from corporations. Aren't you slapping your own voters in the face?
Of course you are. And that's the point I was trying to make before I was so rudely interrupted. That Pete Buttigieg, I thought, was their best shot because I just want to stress this as clearly as I can. I find identity politics repugnant. I have to talk about identity politics because that's what the other team is doing, but that doesn't mean I agree with it. I think the whole thing is repugnant, nevertheless. With that said, Pete I thought, of all the remaining candidates, had the best chance of combining the radical wing of the Democratic Party because of 2 things. He's young and he's gay. And still have the best chance of retaining some of the working class people that used to be the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. But having just looked at a right angle show we did just yesterday, and probably be out in a day or two, or is already out actually, when you see how badly Donald Trump whoops all Democratic contenders, but Pete Buttigieg especially, and it's not in Texas. It's in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, working class blue collar states. This is the heart of the Democratic Party in terms of their voting bloc, and it's also used to be the heart of the Democratic Party in terms of their exact very identity. The Democratic Party was the party of the working man. It was the party of the little guy. I don't believe that they did much good for the little guy, but put that aside. That was their brand, Scott. That was their brand. We stand up for the little guy, for the working man, for the blue collar guy, for the union guy, the truck driver, the factory worker, and so on. Okay. When you have Barack Obama coming in and basically putting economic conditions down that make sure that as many of those blue-collared working people get fired as possible. And Hillary Clinton comes in and AOC comes in and Bernie Sanders comes in, and they start talking about things like the Green New Deal and all the rest of it. All this stuff that's going to take money out of the pockets that have had $5,000 average increase in the last 2.5 years under Donald Trump. If it turns out that Pete Buttigieg is going to be vilified for having held a job and having enough pro-business sense that he understands that business opportunities are good for everybody, if he's being pilloried for this, then I don't see any way that these people can win this election. None. And I think they get further out of touch every day. And I think the further out of touch they get, the more determined they are to believe this echo chamber of, and nothing is going to shock them out of this except for a Donald Trump landslide. And I don't even think that will do it.
Well, let me read a quote from your brother in arms when it comes to this issue, and I'm paraphrasing the beginning of it, and then I'll specify at the end. Basically, he's saying that Democratic candidates talking about free college and free health care and a big retirement bonus and a guaranteed income, those issues that are being discussed by the top candidates for the Democratic nomination for the president, he says, quote, "None of that is about how we're going to grow the economy and grow success." Bill, those are the comments of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, former chief of staff for the Obama administration. What do you make of that?
Was he referring to Obama?
He was referring to the current field of Democratic candidates and criticizing them because they're not talking about growing the economy and making America successful, but they're talking about giving everything away for free with no apparent underpinning of an engine that would generate the kind of revenue required to be able to give everything away.
Yeah, I was going to say that Rahm Emanuel's well known as the son of a communist newspaper editor, but I got my Barack Obama sycophants mixed up. Turns out that was David Axelrod. So look, the reason that the progressives even exist at all, and I mean this, it's clear from all the evidence on the board. The only reason that the Democratic Party's progressive wing exists at all is because they become masters at concealing what it is they really want. Which is why when Barack Obama explains his 1,000 Sundays with Reverend Wright, he does it apparently in a flag factory surrounded by 20,000 American flags in the background. They're slow, but they eventually get it. He was under a lot of criticism for not wearing a flag pin, and then suddenly he did, because he understood that in order to gain power for their anti-American, anti-business, control freak policies, you have to fool the rubes while winking at the smart people who vote for you, fully aware of the fact that they know and you know you're not going to do these things that you say to those dumb, ignorant knuckle draggers over in flyover country. We're just saying that to get elected. Don't worry. Once we get in, then we'll really start to take the country apart. And for Rahm Emanuel to say this is for Rahm Emanuel to understand the fundamental economic truths of how the world works and to promote them in order so that he can get himself and his co-conspirators into power so that they can destroy those things. They're not as stupid as they look. But of course, how could they be?
So you're saying that Mayor Emanuel's comments were strictly of a tactical nature, basically saying, look, we all want all this free stuff to be handed out from the hands of Democratic politicians into the hands of our voter base, but we can't talk about that. We need to talk about making America great again.
We need to talk about racial injustice and Black Lives Matter.
But he's specifically saying economy.
No. I'm being misunderstood. When he's saying economy because it sounds reasonable. And it sounds reasonable because it is reasonable. But that doesn't mean he believes it. If he believed it, he wouldn't have been working for Barack Obama. If he believed it, he would have been working for Mitt Romney, and he's not. Although I have to say, given what I've seen lately, let's just say he should have been working for Donald Trump. If he really believed in economic growth, he wouldn't be support a guy like Barack Obama who did his level best to absolutely squash economic growth in order to have people dependent on the government of which he is the head. So when Rahm Emanuel says something like this, Rahm Emanuel is speaking the truth, and he's not accidentally speaking the truth, but he's speaking the truth in order to improve his camouflage in terms of what it is he actually believes. And what Rahm Emanuel actually believes is pretty clear from the kind of people that Rahm Emanuel is associated with and the job he's done in Chicago as well.
Final question, and this is a broader question that was sparked by reading this story and sort of the anti-corporation, the anti-business backlash, the celebration of public service. From a conservative perspective, I'm sure you're not going to say that there's no virtue in public service, but how do you kind of evaluate private sector vis-a-vis public sector service in terms of conservatism? Like, what is the virtue equation there?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I want to get to that in just one second. But you reminded me of something that had been kind of floating around this whole segment here. When you hear people say public service, that should immediately cause you to drop your TV dinner, stand up, and turn up the volume. Although those are olden things, just reach for the remote, turn up the volume, and listen to what the person speaking has to say when they talk about a life of public service. Public service is what Bill and Hillary Clinton talked about when these two grifters ended up with well over $100 million worth of actual money as a result of their public service. Maxine Waters has 3 or 4 mansions as a result of her public service, and so do all of the rest of these scoundrels. And so when you say public service, what you get from the sentence, the way those 2 words are constructed, public service means I gave myself in service to the public.
Right.
I didn't care about myself. I cared about the other people.
Donald Trump donates his salary every quarter. He donates his presidential salary to some aspect of the government that is helping people who are poor. Or the most recently, he gave it to the agency that's helping fight the opioid crisis.
Correct. And so when you talk about personal gain, which is in everybody's equation, you find out that the only genuine public service in the entire country right now is Donald Trump, who is actually taking a pay cut to do this. You see, that's actually serving the public. You're taking a pay cut in order to do this thing that's not fun and not pleasant and is certainly not enjoyable by him. But when you hear public service being bandied about, especially by Democratic operatives, what you find is that they're talking about the process of becoming fantastically wealthy without having to work at a job. That's what public service means. Now, to address your issue of is there public service in terms of the hypothetical morality of it or the idealism of it? Yes, there certainly is. Donald Trump is an extreme case of it, but I think that anybody look. I define public service. I think the most clear-cut example of public service in the country right now that comes to off the top of my head anyway is jury duty, because jury duty is not only inconvenient. Jury duty can be exceedingly bad for your business. And I've had to face that opportunity several times when I would say, I cannot be gone for this many weeks. I can't. I am the business. Well, too bad. You're going to have to serve. Okay. So public service is doing something that harms you personally in order to benefit the people. And my theory of government, which is, I can't believe I just said that. Please forgive me, all of my fellow conservatives. I did not mean to say my theory of government. The theory of government that I am a proponent of says that the republic is served by people who are taken out of daily life into Washington to represent those people for a brief period of time, because sooner or later, and it's usually sooner, their experience back home becomes stale and then irrelevant. And so the idea that somebody would be called to serve in Congress or in the Senate at the cost of their business or for some other reason that they found virtually intolerable and they did it anyway, that's public service. And another example of public service is somebody like Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, late in her life, found some fame out of this, but Mother Teresa wasn't helping sick people from her Pacific Palisades mansion by going to glittering fundraisers with Hollywood celebrities in order to raise awareness. She was actually serving the public. Whatever you may think of her, she was living a life of poverty and destitution, surrounded by terrible diseases, because she believed in what she was doing. She didn't end up with $200 million in a mansion in New York City as a result of her public service. So you can have examples of people, and you don't have to agree with their politics. Certainly, I think Gandhi is an example of somebody who basically starved himself and sat on in his room and wove his own cloth because he believed in the image of that and what it meant for his people. That public service is something that at the very least you should not become enriched by, because if you become enriched by public service, it's very tempting for people like me to say, I don't know if that's public service so much as it is private benefit. And as a guy who believes fantastically in private benefit, I think that there's nothing wrong with private benefit, but just have the fundamental character integrity to say that I'm doing this for my own good. And if it does good for the public as well, then that's great.
And that's exactly what we're doing here. We are selfishly doing what we love to do, but there are a bunch of other people who love to see us do it. And they're called the members at BillWhittle.com. They're the ones who contribute and make it possible for us to, live this life of virtual mediocrity and to be able to advance these ideas around the world. We are grateful for their contributions, for the folks over at patreon.com/BillWhittle who have contributed as well. We love the members at BillWhittle.com and forever feel a sense of gratitude that can never be repaid.
That's right. This life of tepid sustainability is due entirely to our commitment to American principles.
That's right. I'll be taking a sailboat from Texas to California to meet with Bill later this month. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott.